Hey everyone, you're listening to Tough Topics on KUR. I'm your host Trisha. Welcome back for another episode. This one will be quite interesting just because it's going to be talking about some stuff that I don't think people tend to talk about with their friends. But yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about consent today. And I have with me a colleague of mine, Justin Trice, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, so as Trisha said, my name's Justin. I am a graduate assistant at the LGBTQ+ Resource Center. And I'm also a counseling, clinical mental health counseling major. I'm going for my master's degree.
I'm really glad you're here. As always, I try to be as inclusive as I can with my shows and the topics that we talk about. And so when I was planning this one for, consent, I was really thinking to myself, like, one, I want a male, like a cisgender male's perspective on this. Mm-hmm. And not because I'm not trying to get any other perspective, but when I was thinking about why I want to talk about consent, I was thinking a lot about, sexual assault. And a typical situation is a sexual assault occurring between two heterosexual cisgender individuals. And just some stuff that I've seen recently, I've just kind of felt like there's just this lack of understanding of what consent is and like why we need to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I was like, let me ask you to chat about that, but then like you have another unique experience and like another layer to this of that, like you identify as gay. So like that also just adds another, like just sprinkles in some a spice to
Absolutely. Well, if there's a stereotype that men handle consent a little differently than women do, what happens when you put two men together?
That was the exact thought that I had. I was like, what would that actually really look like? So that's why I kind of thought of you to bring you on this show. So I'm really glad that you're able to do it. And you and I have, for anyone that's listening, if you're not aware, Justin and I are very good friends, and we've gotten into this conversation multiple times now. So like this is going to be quite a fun one to do, I think. So
absolutely.
Before we really get into like the meat of the show, I'm going to do, of course, a quick event plug for the Women's Center. So on November 11th at 8 p.m., we have a spoken word event with Joanne Leslie. There is a pre-registration required for that. I know that you can probably find that through Engage or on our social media, things like that. On November 12th, we have a women's veteran event to honor women who are veterans of the military. I don't have more information about that, but definitely I'm sure if you go to the veterans page on Kutztown's page, you'll find more information. So that's really all we got going on for right now for events. But if you're free and you need things to do, or if you just want to take care of yourself too, please do on November 13th. So yeah, I guess we will get that started. Actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Okay, so now that I've done the event plug, we're just gonna jump right into the topic of what consent is. If you follow these shows that I do, I always like to kind of throw out there the just general definition of what this topic is. And I always love to do just a quick Google search, just because, when in doubt, when I'm like not really sure what something is, I always just go to Google and see what they say about it. And Google's definition is pretty straightforward. Consent is giving permission for something to happen. But of course, this show is put on through Kutztown University Radio and the Women's Center at Kutztown University. So I felt like it was very important to also know what KU's definition is of consent. So if you go into the key and you look at page 47, you'll find their definition, and it is a knowing and voluntary agreement to engage in specific sexual activity at the time of the activity, communicated through clear actions and or words that are mutually understood. So definitely, obviously, a lot more wordy than Google's giving permission for something to happen. And I'm not surprised that the key is kind of a little bit more wordy. I don't know, like, this definition kind of is interesting to me. How are you feeling about it, Justin?
I mean, well, for one, should consent be so complicated? And you look at Google's definition, it is a handful of words that very easy to understand, giving permission for something to happen. That being said, when we're talking about consent for sexual activity, I think it is a little bit more complicated. And especially when you are dealing with couples who have been together for a while, some of that permission almost tends to end up being more implicit than explicit. So that means it's not stated every time. You learn each other. In KU's definition, it says that it could be communicated through clear actions. So I would say in a couple that makes more sense. As you've learned each other, you know how you're communicating through body language. But with someone new, you don't know that. You're not familiar with their body language. If they're pulling back or not, what does that mean? That's something that you have conversations about as they come up. So if you're at the club and you're dancing with someone, that doesn't necessarily mean that they want anything more than to dance with you. But if you're out with your partner of a year and you're dancing, you might know that that's a sign of good things to come tonight. Like, you know?
Yes.
Like,
I will throw out there, like, dating, like, relationships does not equal consent. So, like, just
right,
because you are dating doesn't mean, like, that your partner is entitled to any sort of sexual activity with you. But I think you are touching on, like, such a, like, I don't know. I always feel like I get to the part of the consent part of my presentation that I give to students, and, like, it sounds so contractual, or, like, it sounds like, I guess, consent technically is black and white, but then we have the relationships that, like, you do learn each other, and you do learn, like, what each other likes and how to kind of read each other's body language. And, like, it doesn't always look like, hey, do you want to have sex tonight? Hey, would you like to suck my penis? Right, like, I know that's
it's awkward.
It does. And I don't know, I feel like when we talk about consent, like, people just assume that that's what that has to be.
Right. I think that for me, when I started dating, after I really, like, learned and thought about consent and what that should look like, I made sure that on my first dates, if I wanted to hold someone's hand, I explicitly asked. I said, "Can I hold your hand?" I asked, "Can I kiss you?" Things like that. You know, very, very explicit, and made sure that I had very clear yes answers for that. We also then had a conversation about what our own sort of consent contract looked like with each other. So going forward, we decided, you know, I trust you to read my body language. I trust you to read my moods and know where I'm at. You can kiss me if you want. You can initiate these contacts or sexual contact with me. But if I'm not feeling it, I'm going to tell you no. And I need you to respect that no when that happens, and pull back. So we sort of had, like, this ongoing understanding that consent between the two of us was implied and less revoked, which I think is kind of how a lot of relationships operate in the long run. But again, that is a relationship. This is not a hookup situation. This is not like a new person. And negotiating what consent looks like for you as a couple is just very individualist process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think consent definitely can look a little bit more implicit and be, quote unquote, like, more assumed, which there's problematic, like I like kind of shiver when I like say the word assumed.
Absolutely.
Because technically consent should never be assumed. But I mean, yeah, like hookups look very different. Going on new dates looks very different. Like I was just on a date a couple weeks ago, and like we, for the most part, really weren't physical at first, like not even like hand holding, didn't really know like where that was at. And it got to a point where I had to be the one to be like, hey, is it okay if I hold your hand? Like, is it okay if I put my hand on your leg? And I continuously checked in and was like, is this okay? Do you like this? And I think the one thing that we're really speaking to is the importance of communication.
Yes,
And
that's what's underpinning all of this.
And just being comfortable with communicating those things. I mean, at first when I was asking him, like if I could do those things, I kind of felt silly. Like I felt silly being like, can I hold your hand? I didn't say it like that, but like, you know, but I didn't want to do anything that made him more uncomfortable if he was already feeling uncomfortable and didn't feel comfortable to express that. So I don't know.
Well, you may also be getting new information about this person through that question. So it may spur other conversations. Maybe you ask, can I hold your hand? And they're like, oh yeah, I love that. Like I'm a touchy-feely person. Like, so, or they might say, like, actually, I'm not really like into PDA. Like, I don't, you know, so it can spur so many other conversations just from that one question, which is really useful.
That's absolutely useful. I've never even thought about it like that, about how like it can give you so much more knowledge about that person beyond just asking for consent. Wow, I never thought about it like that. I don't know, like I've never, you know, I talk about consent in my presentations, but I don't know if I've ever like explicitly in my head defined what consent looks like for me personally. I just know what it doesn't look like. Like I know what my boundaries are. Like I know what would make me feel uncomfortable. So is it like almost like at that point, do you need to have a definition of consent for yourself? Like if you know what you don't like.
Well, I think it's important that people feel comfortable and confident enough to communicate what they don't like. I think that's where we get into some of these gray areas with consent, is when people don't feel comfortable explicitly stating what they don't want. They feel pressure from someone else who they know has good intentions, is perhaps even trying to make them feel good, but they feel almost guilty or bad saying, that doesn't make me feel good, actually. It's like if someone was going to give you a gift and then you were like, actually, I don't want this gift. Like that's an awkward social situation to be in.
I feel like that touches on how people are socialized. And like from my female experience and being a woman, I'm very much taught that like I should just take what I'm given and I should just be okay with like what's happening.
Well, and I think as a man, I've been socialized to take what I want.
Ah, yes. I'm so glad you spoke to that.
Be confident.
Yeah.
Like it's supposed to, if it can almost be conveyed or understood as like being timid if I don't just go for what I want. I'm seen as self-conscious as a man if I actually ask you about these things.
So I feel like it's hard then to like, how do you undo years of being socialized a certain way? And like, I feel like also with society, women are just, we're not allowed to talk about sex. Like we're not allowed to talk about our vaginas. We're not allowed to talk about like our body parts and like sensuality and like what makes us feel good. Those are like naughty topics. But I feel like men are allowed to talk about those things and kind of like brag about it a little bit, which I think that also kind of can influence the type of conversations that happen around sex, even within a relationship. Because I've had students like share that they're like, we don't like we don't talk about that,
right? Because
they're just super uncomfortable,
right? Well, in the conversations, if you're thinking like stereotypical male locker room talk about sex, they're also not talking about things like consent, and they're not talking about things like So I'm with this person, and like I really want to like please them. Like I really want to like have better sex with them. So like, do you guys like know like something that like is just really hits right? You know, like for your person, like maybe I can try that. Like it's more about objectifying the partner than it is about pleasing the partner. Like that's not even part of the conversation normally.
It's really interesting that you just brought that up, because I was so what I'm hearing is like you're saying like men will ask their friends for like suggestions on what they could do to have better sex instead of asking the person that they're having sex with.
Yeah.
That
would be more likely. Yeah.
That's bonkers.
Yeah, but then you also have like a lot of articles that are marketed. I've seen like Cosmopolitan magazine and things like that. It's like all of these tips for women as to how to please their partner, things like that. So there's also a lot of media messages put on women about like, you should educate yourself on how to please a man. Like, but what about the other side of it?
So I feel like I'm coming to understand that like the reason why consent conversations are never well received is because the responsibility is not in the right places. You know what I mean? Like if women are learning how to please a man, and a man is learning how to please himself, then like,
or maybe pleasing his partner is more like it's not actually the main goal, right? Like perhaps like suiting his own ego and his own like feeling that power as a man is important, and like perhaps pleasing his partner is going to contribute to that ego boost, right? But normally it's not about going into it as like I'm all about my partner.
So during that ego boost, like, does consent even like come up in the brain? Like,
I mean, I certainly can't speak for all other men, but I think that there is this idea of like, well, maybe I know what you want.
So assumptions.
Yeah. Maybe so it might not even be all about the guy, but like there's a lot of assumptions of like, I know how to take care of you. I know how to do this for you.
Or just assumptions about like body language and like reciprocation of things. Like, I feel like it can be really easy to assume that just because you're fondling each other that there's going to be more things that take place afterwards. But that's not always the case.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's an interesting conversation that needs to be had between partners too, is teasing.
Oh yeah.
Teasing behavior. Because that can send mixed messages, and intent is not clear when someone is teasing. So the teasing partner should be saying, oh, I'm just being a tease. Or, oh, I just like to rile you up, but don't think you're getting any right now. Like, even if you want to say it playfully, but like you got to communicate that like that's what it is.
But I feel like I have been in situations where I have explicitly said like, I'm just being a tease, like I'm just being playful, I'm just being XYZ, and like it is met with like anger and aggression and like entitlement of like.
So I think that's because I'm loath to like speak for all men, right? But I can tell you my personal experience, and I think it has to do with male psychology, either how we're socialized or biological influences, hormones, whatever. I definitely think between the women and the men I've talked to, I have a more similar experience to most men on this. There's sort of not like a point of no return in terms of like getting riled up for sexual activity for men, but like it definitely feels like there's this voice inside your head that's like, and it almost doesn't feel like yours sometimes. It's well described as a drive, where it's like, oh, like we're almost there. Like you can't do, like you can't stop me there. Like it feels like, it does almost feel like being wronged somehow to get like close and then not. And it doesn't feel like that voice or that feeling is like coming from me, like the everyday me. It feels like it's coming from a much more like almost primal place. And like, just you feel almost like your body, like the hormones raging or whatever it is, you're like, yeah, it's hard to stop that train. And when you think about testosterone's associations with perhaps like dominance, anger, things like that, it kind of makes sense if you're peaking it in that moment through that teasing, that if you slam the brakes on that activity, you're going to get some of that response. And I'm not justifying that response at all. Men are still very capable of knowing that is wrong, to be clear. But it does sometimes feel like you're fighting your own self in order to do the right thing. It feels like you're fighting your own biology or this drive that's like, man, you should really do. It's like you're really thirsty and someone's saying you can't have this water. It's like, yeah, I'm mad you took the water away from me. I'm really thirsty. But that doesn't. But with sex, it's not the same kind of need as thirst or hunger or sleep. It's still a need, but it's something that we do with a partner. It's something we're not fully in control of for ourselves. So that's why we need that permission. We need that explicit dance between the two.
Do you think then like that primal feeling, or like that almost like kind of not necessarily out of body experience, but like that experience, do you feel like is why it's almost like easy for men to be like, I didn't know she didn't want it, or like kind of teeter on the side of like coercion, like?
Well, I think you can want it so badly it might blind you to the fact that someone else doesn't want it, because it can almost be hard to conceive that the other person doesn't want it as much as you when you want it so badly, I think. And that's when you start having thoughts of perhaps, well, maybe I just need to do this and they'll be in the mood for it. Like there, you start filling in, like rationalizing it. Like, yeah, like I just haven't done the right thing yet. I haven't pushed the right button yet. Let me keep trying to push buttons on the control panel.
Meanwhile,
until I get
like,
the response.
I don't want my buttons pushed.
Right. And that's, I think, where it breaks down. I think for a lot of men, if they're in that moment and they have their drive going, it's sort of like, it does sort of become a, like, well, how can I convince you to go along with this? Because I feel like this is a train I'm having a really hard time stopping, and it would be way easier for me on my part if we could like make this happen somehow. Like,
yeah.
Like, instead of, so like if I can get you to enjoy it as much as I'm gonna enjoy it, and I know I can, then like that sounds like the ideal situation over stopping the train.
But it also, like, it kind of sounds selfish.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, like, it is not your partner's responsibility to figure out how to stop that train.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know you touched on that by saying, like, it does not, like, take away the responsibility of men, like, knowing how to stop and, like, how to step away.
Absolutely.
And to almost, like, de-escalate themselves in a way.
Well, society definitely doesn't train us to do that.
No, it does not.
Definitely does not train men to de-escalate their own sexual behavior. No, not at all. Or to self-regulate that. And I mean, it even goes back to like in teen years. I mean, think about like, I mean, guys, when they get to a certain age, they start masturbating a lot, and that's like all on their own time, on their own terms. Like that sexual drive, it's kind of like, I want it, I'm going to go masturbate now. Like, so then when they decide that they want to involve a partner, I think maybe there's almost that same desire for instant gratification sexually. It's like, well, I could have it when I wanted it before. Yeah, that's just a theory.
Yes.
But
I feel like right now is a great time to take a quick break, because I want to touch on something that I mentioned before, which is kind of, we've danced around some sexual coercion, I think, a little bit. So we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR with your host, Trisha, and we will be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Tough Topics on KUR. I'm your host, Trisha, and today's topic has been discussing consent. We just took a quick break. Before the break, we were talking a lot about a lot of stuff that I think is just, I don't know. During the break, Justin and I were talking about how we don't think a lot of people are comfortable having this conversation. We were talking about consent more as like an instinctual thing than like just something that is simple as like saying yes or no, or understanding a yes or no. This conversation kind of, before I get into the sexual coercion part of this, there was an article that I had read that I think really speaks to like the conversation that we were just having. And it is ultimately, there was a study done, University of Michigan interviewed male college students in 2015. Each could articulate at least a rudimentary definition of the concept or of consent. The idea that both parties wanted to be doing what they were doing. Most also endorsed the current yes means yes standard, which requires active, conscious, continuous, and freely given agreement by all parties engaging in sexual activity. Yet, when they were asked to describe their own most recent encounters in both a hookup or relationships setting, even men who claimed to practice affirmative consent had not. When they realized, and this is the part, like I'm getting to the part that I was like, ooh, let's talk about that. When they realized that their actions conflicted with the benchmark that they had just endorsed, like in this interview had just been like, yes, like this is what the standard should be, and like I agree with this, I do this. When they realized that their actions conflicted with that, they expanded their definition of consent rather than questioning their own conduct or their own behavior that was problematic. Their ideas of yes were so elastic that for some they encompassed behavior that met the legal criteria for assault. And they give an example about a guy who had coerced his girlfriend into anal sex. And like I said, we'll get into the coercion part later or shortly, I guess. I feel like Justin and I were really, mostly Justin, I was kind of just I was all along for that ride. We talked about how like, it's just because there's this like, this train going, men still need to figure out how to stop it on their own. That's their own responsibility.
Absolutely.
And it is concerning that like a study shows that instead of questioning and taking responsibility for their own actions and behavior and conduct, they're like, let me just push those boundaries even more.
Yep.
I guess I'm just like left wondering, like, is that because, and I think you and I have talked about this before, is that because like at the end of the day, like no one wants to admit that they've crossed boundaries and may have committed a sexual assault?
I mean, absolutely.
Or is it like men just aren't taught to take responsibility for their aggression and their bad behaviors because of how our society just socializes men and women?
I think it's, well, yeah, I mean, I think it's both. And I also think that there is, like, in terms of like society and how like we socialize men. There is this idea, in fact, endorsed by even a lot of women, that men need to be these confident, macho people in order to be attractive. And I feel like that very much conflicts with the idea of control yourself. Take charge and control yourself are two completely different messages.
Yep, that is very true.
And a lot of women will say, I like a guy that takes charge.
But then like, wait, hold on, control yourself.
Right. And it's kind of like, and then, I mean, not necessarily rightfully so, but it's understandable how the guy's like, what?
Like, what am I supposed to be doing?
Right. Because, especially because his biology and his hormones are also influencing him to go the direction of take charge. So without early conversations and their development, talking about, like, definitely in teen years, it should be happening.
I feel like, though, like, the idea of being, like, I know that those two ideas are very conflicting, but they're taking out of consideration, like, when, I think it's, one, okay to have someone that you want someone in your life that kind of, you know, takes the lead in areas. But I think, like, no one asked for someone to take charge and sexually assault the other person.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Not.
Like, I think there's still a level of like responsibility that needs to be taken on the guy's part, that like no one said that you had to take charge in a sexual way. Like no one said that. It was never explicitly like asked. No one asked for that. And then I think it's hard because then the like control yourself, it came about because it was very apparent that men can't do that. That like for whatever reason, like we do say no, we do give like explicit consent to not, or that was confusing. We take away consent, or we don't give consent for something and it's still disregarded. So I don't know, there's something about, I can see it like on a surface level why that would be conflicting and confusing. But I don't know if I fully accept that. I feel like part of me doesn't accept that because they're like, and I know that like men that sexually assault women or rape women are not a representative sample of the general male population. But like you have to wonder, like people like Brock Turner, who like looked at Chanel Miller when she was really messed up and like blackout drunk as an opportunity to serve himself. She was unconscious. Like, at what point, like how far do we need to go for men to get it, like to be able to override that, like that instinctual part of them of like, this is mine to take and I want it now.
Well, I mean, I can definitely tell you, just in thinking about the circumstances of that event, alcohol being involved. Alcohol, probably not a good idea when sex is concerned, because you're not thinking as clearly. And if it takes a level of rationalization and understanding for men to put the brakes on it, again, not an excuse, but like it's to understand that why this is happening. That's likely part of why this is happening. It's because that part of their brain that's going to kick in and say, no, consent's important. Like
logic and reasoning.
Right. Is like not happening in that level.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of why, like,
if we're going to base urges, if we're going to more animalistic behavior, the goal of any animal is to procreate. That's the base drive, procreate.
I mean, the rule of like, and I think it's a criminal investigation. Like if, well, okay, I'm not going to go there. if there was any substances involved in a situation, neither party technically can give consent.
Right.
Which that's such a gray area that I don't like to really dip my hand into because it gets messy very quickly. But in that case, like,
plenty of people have had sex while intoxicated.
You can have, whatever moments while intoxicated. I was almost going to be like, really fun times, and I was like, that sounds problematic. In the case that you were talking about, though, like, you have to be careful with that because that teeters victim blaming. Because
oh no, I'm saying Brock should have known better than to drink so much that he couldn't make the right decision.
Okay. Because see, I took that as like I didn't take it fully like this, but like, it is often thought like it's the woman's fault if she's sexually assaulted, if she's been drinking, because like she put herself in a vulnerable situation. But like, Chanel actually has like a really good comeback to that. In her one interview, she said, sexual assault should not be that's not a consequence of drinking too much. A hangover is. Right.
Absolutely.
So I was like, I want to make sure people know we're not victim blaming.
No, absolutely not. No, that it's really about like people need to develop a certain self-awareness of what they're like when they're intoxicated. What sort of boundaries they are willing to push when they're intoxicated, and maybe they need to listen to friends when it comes to that. That if they notice that their friend has noticed a behavior that they tend to get pushier with women when they drink, like maybe you shouldn't drink when you intend to engage in sexual activity then. Like, and that's something that you're fully in control of.
That's also kind of speaking to like holding your friends accountable.
Absolutely.
If you see your friend like getting way too drunk and like way too messed up, like, call them out on their like problematic behavior, because no one deserves to be sexually assaulted or preyed on, which that's a common thing. Men just generally, like, I've experienced this. I've gone out and I've said, no, I don't want to dance with you. And I get followed. And it's like, I said no, but like, because they're in an intoxicated state, their logic reasoning is not there. And but we just went down a hole that I was not expecting us to go down. So I'm going to bring us back to like kind of where we were. Like, when you're thinking about consent, like, be realistic about what you define as consent and have a conversation with your partner about it, because those conversations can make or break just one night together. Recently I've done a presentation and I've had a student ask, okay, so like, what if I said no, but then like they kept like kind of pestering me about it and like kept kind of like annoying me about it. And I said yes. So like, explicit was technically like
verbal consent,
a verbal yes was given. It was explicit. It was whatever. Is that sexual assault? And I was like, yes. Because, and I said to the student, like, you just described sexual coercion. You were not willfully giving consent. You were giving consent because you were intimidated / like, not forced in like a physically forced way, but you felt forced to say yes because you, one, didn't feel like there was another option to say, like, you didn't feel like you could say no. So like, what else were you supposed to do? That's not a willful yes. That's not a good yes.
We should be looking for an enthusiastic yes, not I wore you down. Yes.
I intimidated you. I pressured you. I did whatever. But I think the sexual coercion can look like, let me find more buttons to press. Like when we were having that conversation, I was like, ooh, that sounds like we could border like pressuring, like, are you sure you'll like it? Like, you really liked it when I was like doing XYZ, or when I was playing with your nipples, or like whatever. And then you're like, really uncomfortable, but like you don't feel like you can say no. But in the guy's head,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he's thinking, I found the button.
Right. I found my way in.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll have sex at some point now because I found the gateway there.
Mm-hmm.
Found an alternative path. I can't just go right to sex, but maybe I can engage in some foreplay, and then maybe that'll change the equation.
Mm-hmm.
The outcome will be different.
Mm-hmm. I always feel like, I don't know, sexual coercion is hard because, again, no one wants to sit there and be like, I was technically sexually assaulted, because
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we talk about sexual coercion from a male's perspective, I also feel like there's a lot of men out there that like kind of, that wasn't their intent,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to consider impact over intent, right? Because like
Mm-hmm.
maybe at the end of the day when they cut, like, what's that statement, like moment of clarity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like they have their moment of clarity and they come out of it and they're like, and then the partner maybe at that point feels comfortable expressing like, hey, that wasn't like, I didn't enjoy that.
Right. Well, when I'm referring to like that drive that's occurring, that like little voice, whatever you want to call it, it's almost like this internal pressure. Yeah, after orgasm, traditionally, like that will go away. So then that's when you have that moment of clarity, is like you may then, only then, be able to think about, oh, I pushed this person more than I should have, or I shouldn't have pushed them at all, or, you know, like, that's when you start having like maybe that moment of regret. But then you wouldn't even know how to process that. To like, you wouldn't know how to have that conversation either. Like, no one tells you how to have that conversation typically.
And maybe that's why we see guys expand their definition of consent, because they don't,
instead of having to reconcile what they just did.
Yeah. Because again, like I said earlier, like who, like, I feel like it would not be comfortable to sit there and know that I crossed someone's boundaries.
I mean, if that happened with you, like if someone had sort of coerced you a little bit and you didn't feel like saying no was an option, like, and then afterwards the guy said, wow, I'm sorry, I realized that I went too far. I mean, what would that conversation look like? How would that feel? Would that feel like that? I mean, it would still feel bad, right? It would still feel like a gross situation, but I mean, maybe I think a guy's thinking that conversation is hella awkward and uncomfortable, and this person already feels the way they feel, and I don't know that talking about it's going to make that better.
Yeah. I was just literally sitting here thinking, like, I've never had that happen. Like, I've had some sketchy moments in my sexual experiences, but I've never once had a guy, like, kind of look at me and being like, I think I overdid it. And it could partly be because it feels awkward. It doesn't feel right to have that conversation. But I think there is a part of me that really feels like there's a decent amount of men that don't realize that it was wrong. They leave that moment of clarity still feeling like it was all fine and dandy because they got what they wanted. They got what they were chasing after. And I think, and you and I have talked about this before, that is like a window into my perspective of each partner's roles in pleasure during sex. Like, I'm trying to think of how I worded it to you before. because you had mentioned, like, because I was like, well, I go into it feeling like there's a lot of pressure or an expectation that he gets off,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that like he benefits from it. And so like I've taken like a state of like, no, I'm not gonna play that game anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not interested in doing the sex with anybody if like it does not involve me getting off.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you had shared like, oh, that's interesting, because I feel like from the male's perspective, it's more like there's so much pressure for him to get the female off.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or even in my my homosexual relationships, like I definitely feel pressure to please my partner. But I think sometimes it feels complicated, and then especially if you're not good at communicating, like if you're not communicating with your partner about what they like and don't like, it's going to be really hard to please them, probably. So the way you reduce that pressure is to talk about it, but people think that talking about sex is awkward,
Mm-hmm.
and that it takes some of the fun out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's all should be wrapped into consent, is like, and I think talking about sex in general and talking about what you like and don't like.
And your expectations of sex.
Right.
And of each other.
Right.
In a sexual way.
One thing that I really wanted to bring up though in terms of like coercion is like, so obviously physiologically cis men and cis women have different bodies, and men have erections.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a very visible sign of like arousal typically. Mm-hmm. I understand that the assumption is if a guy is erect, then he wants something with that. Mm-hmm. It's often taken as an explicit sort of thing that means guy wants sex. Mm-hmm. Let me tell you, this is definitely not just me. I've talked to other men about this. If they get an erection when they're cuddling with you, it is not always about sex. Mm-hmm. But you might be interpreting that as pressure to have sex.
I've absolutely interpreted a cuddle boner
mm-hmm.
as them wanting to have sex.
Absolutely. I think this is a very common thing that people think, and that's why I think it's so important to state, because that is oftentimes not an attempt to coerce, especially if there's no grinding behavior or things like that. If you're honestly just
doing the cuddle.
Just doing the cuddle, spooning, laying in bed together under a blanket, like honestly, a lot of guys will get an erection in that circumstance because they're comfortable and happy with you.
And they feel safe.
Yes. Like, so it's actually just because when they relax, it's easier to get an erection. So they're saying, I'm comfortable with you in this moment. And that has nothing to do with sex. I'm not saying they can't, like that's not on their mind ever. Right? This is not a blanket statement in that way. But I'm saying that there are different intents. Don't assume the intent of the guy based on whether or not he has an erection. Mm-hmm. That would be wrong.
Which I think is also like, and I think we have talked about this too, like there's this big assumption that like if a guy, that a guy can't be sexually assaulted because mm-hmm. He had an erection. Mm-hmm. Or that he can't be sexually assaulted by a female because he had an erection, mm-hmm. or that he would have wanted that. And that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing we've talked about is that, I mean, again, the penis, I mean, it reacts to physical stimuli actually pretty easily. Like, there's not a whole lot that you can do to it other than apply immense pressure that isn't going to feel kind of good. So, like, and will actually, it will trigger the nerves and stimulate an erection, whether the guy wants it or not. Like, it is easy to stimulate the penis to achieve an erection, regardless of mental state. So, and sex oftentimes may feel good to a male, even if he's not in the mood to have it. That's why I think there seems to be this like openness, or there's this perceived openness by most men. It's like, we have sex anytime. Well, it's to some degree that's because it's easy. It's not hard to make it feel good, I think. And so, whereas I know, like, when speaking to many women, that it's not the same sort of thing. It's you know, it's not consistently good. You can do the same thing and a different night, it's not going to feel the same way. Like, it hits different for cis men and cis women. So I think that, yeah, you just can't assume anything about an erection and sexual assault, for sure.
Yeah. I don't know, I feel like this is a good opportunity to kind of wrap up, because I feel like we touched on such vast topics of consent. And I think that gives me a good opportunity to highlight that consent is just bigger than the black and white yes and no.
Oh yeah.
But for some people, they're not getting it, right? Like, they're not understanding what consent is. So now we have had to be like, yes means yes and no means no. At the end of the day, if you take away anything from this episode, have a conversation. Be open in your conversations with your partner or your hookup. I empower anyone to guide someone. If you are enjoying your sexual experience and then there's some moments that you're not, guide them, have a conversation, say, hey, I liked it when you did this. I don't really like that motion at all. Those things can go such a long way. And kind of like what you said earlier, like, you learn so much from your partner by just asking a simple, do you like this? Or is this okay? You can just gain so much more knowledge about them that I think is important. And if you don't know how to have that conversation, be honest about that too. My policy is always just be honest. Be as transparent as you can about your uncomfortability, about those things. So
honestly, yeah, if you preface it and be like, honestly, I feel like this is awkward as hell, but like, I kind of feel like I need to ask you this. You know, if you sort of set that tone, then people are like, oh, okay, like, I understand. Like, they almost are empathetic to the fact that this is awkward for you.
Yeah, there's a little bit more like compassion in the conversation. We obviously, like, something needs to happen, because consent is clearly for some just not understood. So yeah, have conversations, be open about sex. If you don't know, and I'm gonna throw this out there, if you don't know how to have conversations with your partner about sex, reach out for other support. Like, I know sometimes I have some of the best conversations with my friends. Here at the Women's Center and at the LGBTQ+ Resource Center, one of the biggest conversations we have is about sex, because we know that these conversations aren't had in high school or in middle school, which are really pivotal years in your understanding of consent and relationships and what that should look like. So feel free to reach out about anything. And if you have any concerns, if you are concerned that maybe you were sexually assaulted, please feel free to reach out to the Women's Center. You can reach out to me directly. My KU email is tgill664, and then the @live part. Or you can reach out to Christine Price. She's the director of the Women's Center. Her email is price@kutztown.edu. We understand that sometimes people listen to these conversations and they're like, I think I was assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not easy to digest. So feel free to reach out for support. We're always here. But thanks for tuning in for Tough Topics. It's been a great one so far. I appreciate anyone tuning in, and then anyone in the future that listens to this as a YouTube video or a podcast version. I appreciate the support. Yeah, you're listening to Tough Topics on KUR, and I'm Trisha.